I have a very interesting topic for you, and I want to say a couple things to frame it. First, I want to have this really as a conversation. Certainly anything I'm going to say tonight should not be taken as received wisdom. It's really my own sort of clumsy effort to make sense of my work. But it's led me to very extraordinary places and experiences, and I wanted to share those with you tonight. The reason I say that about conversation is the work I was doing in East Africa, where I worked in Kenya for several years, was often characterized by meeting people from very different worlds whose even conception of reality, of causality, basic things like truth or certainty or belief were quite different from each other. And we actually came to a consensus that dialogue itself may be the epistemology of our time. We're faced with extraordinary dimensions of pluralism in modern communications and travel that we've never seen in the world before. So really, I'm interested in what your thoughts are, and want to present this really as the beginning of a conversation on this renewed, this phenomenon of this renaissance or renewed interest in the use of psychedelics, both in medicine and more broadly, in their potential as therapeutic agents. The fascinating pharmacology that's associated with them, and we'll go into that a little bit. And also probably the most important thing that I want to emphasize tonight is how can we revisit this whole area and avoid the mistakes of the 60s. Not to say that there weren't successes of the 60s. I think there certainly were. But how can we do it better? What have we learned from the time that these agents have been in wider circulation, from the rather substantial writing that has occurred since the 60s on the use of psychedelics in various settings? I want to come back to each of those issues to some degree with you. But I think I just want to emphasize that my focus for tonight is really approaching this topic as a physician, with attention toward healing, toward how to work with these agents in a way that is beneficial for people, safe. In the world of trauma, you know, it's safety and trust, which are the most important elements that should attend a therapeutic encounter. Those are the things that really mean a lot to people who have suffered from trauma. And when you're talking about agents such as we're going to talk about tonight, the power is enormous. The induction of an altered state experience can make a person, really can shake their worldview and can be attended by enormous vulnerability. So it's important that the work be done properly with the proper ethical guidelines, and that where possible, our roles as healers or physicians is to make sure that the patients or the participants are safe and supported. I have to talk to you about, you know, we had planned this talk, I think maybe 4 or 5 months ago now. As many of you know, I'm a principal investigator with a very interesting trial here at UCSF on post-traumatic stress disorder and the use of MDMA, which also has the name ecstasy, which we don't usually use, since the street names of ecstasy and Molly and these things often refer to substances that have several agents within them. The clinical trial that we're doing, of course, uses pure MDMA, and it may be quite different than many of the anecdotal and case reports that have been reported with the use of ecstasy in club settings. So that's an important point that we'll come back to. But I have to tell you something that I'm sorry about. When we planned this a few months ago, we had just finished the phase 2 trials with MDMA, which have been really interesting and encouraging. And we weren't sure when the phase 3 trial would start, but the good news is the phase 3 trial was approved and has been started at UCSF and in a private practice setting here in San Francisco only about 3 weeks ago, so it's recent. The bad news is that I just came back from FDA and DEA meetings where we were advised that since I'm a principal investigator, I can't talk about the trial. The phase 3 trial is an FDA-registered trial, clinicaltrials.gov. It's an investigational new drug trial for MDMA, and the phase 3 trial is double-blinded with a placebo control. And so one of the prohibitions for PIs, for principal investigators, is that we don't talk about the trial when it's happening. And it's also a media policy of UCSF for formal trials and for the sponsor MAPS. So I'm sorry about that. I can tell you that the phase 2 results are published and they're available, and we're going to make them the reference and possibly the article as well, but the reference certainly, and it's widely available on the med school website, on the mini med school website, so you'll have this. Suffice it to say that the phase 2 results were encouraging, and the reason that the phase 3 trial was approved and is going forward. So after lots of consternation about that, I decided I would tell you a little bit about my own experience with these agents, and particularly my own discovery of ayahuasca, which has been very important in my life. And so in doing that, I probably will get into a few digressions that have to do with how these agents work, how we think about them, for example. One of the things that I grappled with when I first began to explore this, which is now more than 25 years ago, was how do you know that a healer is a good healer if you're out of our context? I mean, you might even ask the same question about doctors in the conventional setting. You don't necessarily go by their degrees, although that's usually what you know about. And so I started asking that question a lot. I also began this inquiry, the slides I'm going to show you tonight, sort of in various phases. And one of those phases was now it was in the mid-90s when I decided that the conventional practice of medicine was a little too narrow for me. At that time, I was on the faculty at Stanford Medical School. I was in the division of nephrology. I was a kidney specialist and running a dialysis center and teaching residents and fellows in nephrology and medicine, and doing a lot of high-tech medicine, ICU medicine, hemodialysis, and peritoneal dialysis. And I enjoyed it. I was impressed with the technology and all that. But we were, as many of you might know, the way the specialties are, on the receiving end of people who were basically getting ready for dialysis. So we would get them at late stages of renal failure. And I started asking the question, shouldn't we be doing more prevention? Isn't there more that we can do? And all that. That was a bit of a crisis for me, since those were questions that really the nephrology division wasn't very interested in at the time. I'm not sure that they are now either, but at that time they certainly weren't. They said that's what happens in general medicine, not in nephrology. We do dialysis, we measure potassium levels and potassium flux and urea flux and these kind of things. So I first, at that time, began to think more broadly, and I said, I'm just going to change my practice. I'm going to start practicing integrative medicine more consciously. This was about 1994. Andy Weil had just published Spontaneous Healing. Many of us were thinking about doing this in a much more holistic way, but not wanting to leave our conventional experience or expertise. I still was quite interested in practicing Western medicine. I respected it. I still do. I think there's a lot that it has to offer. I also think there are quite a few limitations, which we'll talk about a little tonight. And as part of that, I had an unusual opportunity. I had an opportunity to work in a consulting role and take a sabbatical from Stanford and travel around to work with alternative healers. One of the questions that we were pursuing at that time was how does this model of integrative medicine fit into conventional medical centers, hospitals, and what disciplines should we be looking at? So I traveled to China and I worked with a group in Shanghai and Hangzhou, which is a high-tech center in southern China. We visited hospitals and worked with practitioners there. This is a picture of an acupuncture center that is attached to an inpatient hospital, very much integrated. This picture is a bodywork room in the hospital where Tuina massage and bodywork is done, and we met the practitioner there who was doing cervical manipulations and body work to prevent people from going to neurosurgery. So pretty advanced disease, cervical disc disease and no hesitation at manipulation, things that we were really nervous about, certainly in the Western world, to say the least. I also was involved in a project. So I was studying alternative systems, looking at Chinese medicine. We went to India, worked with Ayurvedic practitioners to some degree, and I also, returning to some of my own roots, worked with Indigenous healers in the Americas. In this particular photo, I was working with a group of Indigenous people from this country who were doing recordings of traditional songs, and this is with a group of people from the Seri Nation in southern Baja California. Well, actually, it's on the mainland side, across from the southern tip of Baja, just north of Hermosillo, if you know the area. This is the Seri tribe, also known as the Concac. They are the custodians of the Isla Tiburon, the Tiburon Island, which is a mating area for whales and has a lot of special attributes, a reserve in Mexico. And we were there recording the songs and prayers and healing rituals of this man who was Don Chapo. So let me tell you a little bit about this. So I took this photograph. I'm sort of standing right there. The person directly in the middle, Ernesto, was our guide. He spoke Spanish and Seri and a little bit of English. He's actually hired by the U.S. Army as a survival specialist for survival in arid lands. So he had been in the States, and he was one of our guides. The other two people are elders in the tribe, and the person in the very back was a translator. Ernesto, in the middle, translated Seri to Spanish. That was a mixture of Spanish and Seri. The person in the back, Hilario, he translated Spanish to Spanish that I could understand. And I copied the songs, and we transliterated, actually, some of the songs for the digital recording. And Chapo was a really interesting healer, very, very well known in the area. And no one knew his age, but people told me that he was 70 or 80, which was amazing to me. When we told him why we were there, he was really, really happy to meet us and took us up to this cave where he meditated and prayed and did various healing work. And as I was telling Sudha earlier, when he took me out there, he was all excited about it. I was sort of running through the desert, and I had made sure I had my cowboy boots on because I didn't want to get any rattlesnakes and all that. And when we got to the cave, I looked down at him and I realized that he had been running through the desert barefoot. It was the most incredible thing. There's like big cactuses. I mean, big. And so Chapo was unusual. He also pulled out his rattle, and I thought, wow, that's a real healer. It's a can with a stick of wood through it. And we were talking about this earlier. There's an old joke in medical schools that where you ask the medical student what's the most important part of the stethoscope. Some of you probably heard this, and it's kind of a trick joke. It can be mean. I never did it that way. But the answer is the part that goes between the earpieces. Yeah. So when I saw Chapo, I thought, wow, that's the most important part of a ceremonial rattle. It's the part that's connected to the to the healer. Anyway, this was what I was doing. This is Chapo's. It's his daughter-in-law, his son's wife, and this is his grandson. And the reason I showed this is that one of the things I learned from working with traditional healers around the world is that they are eminently pragmatic. Chapo was well known, and he had been treating his grandson for about a week, and he said, he's just not getting better, so I wonder if you'd take a look at him. So he asked me to consult, and I went and saw his grandson, and I didn't have a stethoscope, so his mother held him up, and I put my ear on his back. And I think she was pretty taken with the maneuver because she just sort of watched. And I sort of concluded that he probably had an otitis. He was febrile and irritable and coughing a lot. Tried to make sure that it wasn't a pneumonia or something like that, or meningitis, worse. And we drove to Hermosillo from there several hours. I think it was about 4 hours. To buy him some ampicillin and some acetaminophen for his fever. Brought it back the next day. And she ran out 2 days later holding it like this, saying, he's better. And Chapo and I became good friends. Later, actually about a year and a half later, I also took a trip down deep into the Copper Canyon, the Barrancas de Cobre, those of you who know northern Mexico. Larger than the Grand Canyon. It's an amazing place, pretty much unknown and not very accessible. We drove 100 miles to get to a small town called Batopilas, way in the canyon. But it's on a road, and this is Tarahumara country, also called Raramuri. This is an indigenous group in northern Mexico that is a fascinating group of people, very isolated from modernity. This is an example of what conventional dress is among the Tarahumara, and this guy was actually sweeping outside my room. And this is also a peyote culture, and it is also historically important among Native Americans in the Americas because the Tarahumara in that particular region was where a lot of Apaches fled to escape the Apache Wars in the U.S. So they're called the Lost Apaches, and a lot of them are intermarried and intermingled with Tarahumara. So I wanted to visit that area. Some of my family are Mescalero, and some are Pueblo, and so I had a lot of curiosity about more ancient ways from my own family. So I traveled into the Barrancas de Cobre also to work with some of these people. And I just put this on there because I wanted to show you the road. This is the road that we drove on, which you can only go about 10 miles an hour. And when we were leaving, these kids started running after us. And I remember the Tarahumara are famous for being runners. They were actually studied by Paul Dudley White and a famous contingent of Boston cardiologists from Harvard in the 1920s because they had a reputation for hunting by outrunning animals. And they're really amazing. They have really big chests. It's kind of, and actually they were actually found to have larger lung capacities. But they also run barefoot, and they're just, anyway, these kids were chasing us because we had to go so slow on this road. And they ended up sort of gaining on us. And so I felt bad about making them chase. And they didn't look like they were going to stop. I thought we got far enough away, and they kept going. And the Tarahumara are famous. I was telling Suda that they can run like 20 miles with no problem. And a lot of people sort of figured there's some genetic adaptation, and clearly there's something about their aerobic capacity. But they also have tricks. They load with chia seed, and some of you may have heard. So they eat chia and they drink water, so they create a gel in their gut, so they don't get dehydrated when they go on distance running. And it's one of the tricks that they use. There are barefoot races now in northern Mexico. I don't know if the runners among you have heard. People come from all over to race. And so these tricks are getting now discovered by runners. Anyway, I thought that was a sort of interesting thing. These kids graced us when I finally stopped with this incredibly dignified and beautiful portrait of who they are, which shows, I think, one of the things that I learned, and that is that there is a presence associated with many of these groups of people that is very important in ceremonial healing, and we'll come back to that. And I couldn't avoid putting up this little girl that we saw a little bit farther down the road, and that was me in those days, a much younger me. So I want to tell you a little bit about ayahuasca. I first heard about ayahuasca when I was an undergraduate at Berkeley. I was kind of a science nerd. I really liked biology and science, and particularly chemistry, actually. So in my organic chemistry, I sort of came across this fascinating issue that the similarities of things like LSD, for example, or dimethyltryptamine, are very close to neurotransmitters, and I'm going to show you what that is. But I wondered about that because we were hearing lots of stories about psychedelics in those times, and I was just fascinated to discover that, and thought there must be some very important connection biologically, and we'll come back to that. A few years later, I came across a book called it's called The Wizard of the Upper Amazon, I think it was called, a book written by Bruce Lamb about an ayahuasca healer. And when I got to medical school a couple of years later, I was in Boston, and it was 1971, so it wasn't too much after the time when Richard Alpert, when Ram Dass and Leary were doing work on LSD at Harvard, and there was a lot of controversy. I was fortunate enough to know some people that were connected with the laboratory of Richard Evans Schultes, who's a famous ethnobotanist and the director of the Harvard Botanical Lab. Schultes always told his graduate students, you will not be an ethnobotanist until you have experienced ayahuasca, which was a very interesting thing. And in the ayahuasca tradition, the plants are considered sentient beings, and ayahuasca is very much regarded as a teacher. So I thought it was fascinating that Schultes, who was a professor of botany at Harvard, would be saying this. And I had some experience with people in his laboratory, and there was this cast of characters moving through there that was extraordinary. Wade Davis, Tim Ploman, Michael Balick, the head of the Botanical Museum in New York, Andy Weil. So I was hearing all these stories about ayahuasca, and one thing really stood out to me, and that was that there were lots of stories of people communicating with animals with ayahuasca. And so I was sort of intrigued by that. I heard about coming-of-age rituals where adolescent boys are taken by their grandfathers. It's an interesting story among the Tucano, which is a tribe in the Amazon area, Brazilian Amazon. Adolescent boys are taken in early puberty from their mother's hut, quote, by their grandfathers, not by their fathers. So that they don't have to worry about betraying the mother, I guess, or something. So the grandfathers are the ones that sort of take them out in the middle of the night to go on a sort of a vision quest with ayahuasca, so that one of the reasons is so that they can learn to not just sort of think like an animal, but feel what an animal feels, and also intuit what an animal is sensing. So there are stories about these 14-year-old boys being in the Amazon and learning how to fly and find where game is, and there are stories about jaguars walking up to a ayahuasca circle and sitting down as long as the energy's right. Some of you have you ever heard of the St. Francis effect? People have run into that. Yeah. So there's a lot of stories about St. Francis, who was clearly a Christian mystic. Who, when he was in deep states of meditation and prayer, that he had such an abiding calm about him that animals would come up to him. And there's a famous story about these two geese, which were like really mean and horrible to everyone except St. Francis, and how they came up to him one time and sort of crossed their two necks over his lap and sort of laid on, his lap. And so I was sort of intrigued by, wow, can the animals sense if we're in a better place and that sort of thing? And does that enhance our communication, et cetera? So all of this led to, again, a few years later, when I was involved with this job of studying with healers around the world, I thought, wow, there's a group that I should, learn about. So I started traveling to Brazil in the late 90s to work with Ayahuasca Healers. So let me tell you a little bit about what happens there. So ayahuasca we'll come to, but it's been used for thousands of years by indigenous people of the Amazon region. Now the ayahuasqueros in Brazil say that the earth is so threatened that ayahuasca is traveling, taking airplanes, and because it's a teacher. And one of the most remarkable things, we'll come back to this, one of the most remarkable things about the experience with psychedelics, especially the tryptamines, and we'll talk about what that means, and ayahuasca is one of them, is that people often come away with, from those experiences with a more profound sense of connection to nature. And in the ayahuasca traditions, nature is really regarded as sacred. And I think to some degree people connect with that. And I remember discussions with Michael Pollan and others where people were asking, well, why does that happen? And I don't think there's a good answer to it, but it is a widely experienced phenomenon, which is something that we'll come back to. In the Amazon, indigenous people often refer to ayahuasca as the vine of the soul or vine of the spirits. We were talking about trauma. Among certain groups in the veterans that work with veterans, for example, there is an idea that much of the trauma that we see with post-traumatic stress disorder is not just trauma in the sense of victimization and all that, but it is also a kind of a soul injury or moral injury that's associated with having to do things where there's just no way out. It's kind of no-win situations, a kind of a Sophie's Choice type of situation, where you're confronted with having to shoot at someone who might be a 14-year-old boy, for example, or get shot at yourself. I mean, these are kinds of, I think of them as injuries to your soul as a human being, things that no one should have to go through and which have really profound effects. And we could talk about that. The reason I mention it is because it was interesting to me that when I was there with Ayahuasca Healers, they, if you talk about these things, they'll say the medicine is really what you need to do. It will teach you. People that were going to these retreats and the group that we worked with for several years are seeking emotional healing or spiritual development, but also self-awareness. We looked at some of the literature. I mean, I did at the time, what was written about it, and generally there were a lot of positive responses. Now, it's not to say that there aren't abuses and problems associated with this. Ayahuasca tourism has become a growth industry. And I don't want to disparage anybody, who's sort of trying to make a living or this or that, but it's simply to say that one of the things that we've learned from the 60s that we're, I think, more aware of now, what wisdom it represents, is the importance of set and setting with psychedelics. And so what do I mean by this? So these are terms that Ram Dass and Leary used early on when people were saying, well, what do these medicines do? And Leary, for one, said, well, it seems to be the interaction of people's expectations, the mental set that they bring, but also the setting, the physical environment, the people that they're with, this interaction of set and setting, which is a fascinating notion. In conventional medical research, we tend to be more reductionistic in our approach. And interaction effects are not something that we study very well, particularly complex interaction effects. But it's very interesting to think about that. In any case, during that time, I was also studying a lot about ayahuasca, what was written, but I was also asking myself, so I'm going to meet different healers, and I'd been going different places. I'd been to China and India and a few places in the Americas. And I was sort of asking myself, how do I know if these are really good healers or not? And the reason I'm going to tell you about Pablo Amaringo is because he's one healer that I worked with who's an ayahuasca healer. Pablo is now, I think, famous because he's the one that's done these sort of very intricate ayahuasca drawings. He died about 4 years ago now, or 5. I came to know him very well and really respected his wisdom and his experience as a healer. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about that as we go along. Pablo was involved in these ceremonial retreats that we went to in Brazil, now again more than 25 years ago. And Pablo would do integration. We're going to talk about that also. He would do integration with art. So after a person would go through an ayahuasca experience, they would have a session with him where you would review your experience, and he would ask people to draw about it. It's important to emphasize another point that we've had to, again, revisit, particularly in the work in the contemporary research with psychedelics, and that is this issue of preparation and integration. So these are two aspects of experience with these agents, which are often left out, that people haven't spent much time preparing, and often after a ceremony ends or something, they fly back a few thousand miles or wherever they're going, and there's no real integration, nobody to talk to about it. It's often pathologized. They often are not sure what happened or how to integrate it. So preparation and integration are really important parts of this work, and in some ways more important than the peak experience itself. And Pablo would certainly understood and taught that, but his way of doing it, I think, was particularly interesting since people drew their results. Those of you who have done breath work, Stan Groff sometimes does this, and sometimes people will draw. So it's a very interesting thing. The point, I think, for us is just to underscore that with these agents, the preparation, and it's not just understanding the agents, but the most important thing about preparation is your intentionality, why you're doing this. So it's important to know what you're praying for, because you might get it, right? But also the integration as well. And that's one of the things that we're attempting to do with this work here tonight, and also among the faculty, is educate ourselves better so that we can talk to people about these experiences in a more enlightened way. There has been a tendency to pathologize these experiences and just sort of set them aside as a drug effect. And I think there's much more going on there. So we'll again come back to that. So ayahuasca is 2 plants, Banisteriopsis caapi, which is a jungle liana. It's a vine that grows to the top of the jungle canopy, sometimes 100 feet. It has an interesting feature, and that is that it's sort of like a double helix. Those of you who've read Jeremy Narby's book, The Cosmic Serpent, he actually goes into some length about helices in nature and all that. And their relations to symbols of transformation, like snakes and serpents, which is interesting. Among traditional people, their observation of the natural world can be orders of magnitude more refined than ours. When I was down there, there was a giant sloth in the canopy of the forest. It was a sloth that was, I didn't really know much about sloths. I hadn't really ever seen one, but they kind of look like, they have long arms and they kind of hang on the trees. But this was up toward the canopy, and we were with a Tucano guide, a young guy who maybe 30, who spoke Portuguese pretty well, and he had been sent to a missionary school from a tribal village in Europe. He was sent to Switzerland, so he actually learned other languages. And he saw this sloth, and everybody had their binoculars, and he was pointing to us right there. And people with their binoculars or without couldn't see it. It was the most amazing thing. There were probably 10 of us in a group, and no one could see it. All the Westerners couldn't see it. It was just him and this other young kid that was with him that could see it. And I realized that kind of sensitivity is not something that we're comfortable with, or in our sort of modern world. In medicine, historically, particularly in homeopathy, but in other traditions as well, there's a theory called the law of similars. Some of you may have heard of it. And this is where remedies are chosen for some signature that they provide in nature, which suggests the phenomenon that they would cure. So, for example, the law of similars would say that if a plant looks like a rattlesnake or something like that, then it may be useful for rattlesnake bites. So the reason that I mention that is this whole sort of coil and helix that the copy vine grows in is part of Shipibo culture, which is a tribe in Peru. Shipibo actually have a word that translates roughly into English as twisty-turny. And they take it from the way ayahuasca grows, but it's their word for how things unfold in life, which is a really interesting law of similar. The other plant in ayahuasca is Psychotria. Psychotria is a shrub that is in the coffee family. And I should go back. Bonasteriopsis has a chemical substance called the harmalines, which is a category, actually, of substances that are MAO inhibitors. These are monoamine oxidase inhibitors. MAO inhibitors are a class of enzymes that basically inactivate, denature, or metabolically transform monoamines, which is a certain class of chemical neurotransmitters or monoamines, like dopamine, for example. So Bonasteriopsis has an MAO inhibitor in it, the harmalines. Psychotria has dimethyltryptamine, and we'll come back to this. Dimethyltryptamine is a tryptamine. It's and I'll show you a little bit about that. It's related to serotonin. Dimethyltryptamine is a tryptamine nucleus. Serotonin is 5-hydroxytryptamine, so it has a hydroxy group on it. And dimethyltryptamine is the tryptamine nucleus with 2 methyl groups. So very similar to the neurotransmitters that we have. So Psychotria and DMT, dimethyltryptamine, are not active orally, because if you eat this, it's denatured in the gut by monoamine oxidase. But when combined with the bark, with Bonasteriopsis and the harmalines paralyze the MAO, and dimethyltryptamine becomes orally active. And this is a fascinating example of pharmacologic synergy. Wade Davis and the people that were from the Harvard Botanical Museum were studying this, and they were saying, wait a minute, this was discovered like 3,000 years ago, or maybe 4, obviously in the pre-scientific period. How did people know this? When they asked the healers, the indigenous healers, they were saying that, the plants talk to us. We communicate with plants. And I was talking about this years ago with someone. Michael Pollan had just written, you've probably seen Michael Pollan's newest book, which is about these agents, How to Change Your Mind. But Michael Pollan at that time had just written a book called The Botany of Desire. And you might have read it. It has some very interesting chapters on apples and cannabis and other things. There's so much in this that I'm just racing through in my mind. What was I telling you about Pollan? I can't remember. Anyway, I'll come back to it. I was worried that my digressions would take me all over the place, and they will, but it's okay. And part of the reason it's okay is this topic is an exploration in expansion of consciousness, really. And there's a lot more there, and you can come back to it. Anyway, this is one of Pablo's pictures, which shows the 2 plants. This is another picture of how ayahuasca is prepared. And the bark is pounded for long periods of time. It's probably worth mentioning, Traditional healers will harvest only at certain times of the moon cycle, at certain times of day, and it's almost always associated with certain prayers and songs. So the plants are really respected in a whole way. I don't remember what I was telling you. So when I was reading the Botany of Desire, I was saying, the plants communicate with people, and to me, I thought that was a big deal. I thought, wow, you can actually communicate with plants, and maybe they have a type of intelligence that's better than humans. That would be an improvement in my life. But I gave this talk to some people, and they said, "Oh, you're not a gardener," and actually, I wasn't. I've changed that a little bit, but my plants always communicate with me, and they were quite comfortable with the notion of communication. And actually, at the time, I did this whole search in the botany literature, and there's a discipline of plant communication. It's called plant semiotics, which is amazing. I mean, there are certain fungi, for example, that put out certain excretory products that change the pH of the soil right around them, and people. In botany, there's a whole story about it just being excretory products, but actually, by changing the pH, they make it favorable for some bacteria that they feed on. So they're actually farming. So anyway, this is part of the talk of altered states. So let me come back to some of these sort of chemistry ideas. One of the most amazing things, so let me just preface this, the work of many people, but notably Sasha Shulgin and others, there are two broad categories of so-called psychedelics. One is the tryptamine category, which is LSD, psilocybin, dimethyltryptamine. The other category are called phenethylamines. And they're more like mescaline, peyote, San Pedro cactus, huachuma, MDMA is in that category. And the reason that that's important is this. So this is epinephrine, more commonly known as adrenaline. You can see that the similarity that dopamine has to it and that serotonin has to it. Okay, you can also see that serotonin has something different here. This is the tryptamine nucleus. Okay, this distinguishes the tryptamines from the phenethylamines. Phenyl is this group, and ethyl is a 2-carbon addition there. So, and these are amino groups. That's how they get their name. So, why is that important? The tryptamine category, this group here, as opposed to the phenethylamine category. The tryptamine category are widely associated with transcendent or mystical experiences. And for that, they have gotten the term entheogens, that they somehow access the divine within and give people an experience of the divine, which is a very interesting thing in its own way. And the phenethylamines, which would be closer here, but also included mescaline. And methamphetamine is, again, you can see quite similar to epinephrine. And MDMA is methylene dioxymethamphetamine. So it has a methylene group and 2 oxygen groups. And one of the things that you learn in organic chemistry, and one of the reasons I was so fascinated by this, is that small side chain alterations in biology can have enormous physiologic and biologic effects. So you can have something that's quite similar, but have a methyl group or a small change in a side chain, and the molecule works completely differently. And of course, this, in biology, this is an old story. This is the lock and key idea of receptors and given agonists in biology, and this is one of the reasons for what we call biologic specificity, why things can be so specific in biology as opposed to in chemistry, where it's more principles of mass action. So this is an important thing biologically. But what I was taken with is, wow, these are agents that somehow help with transcendent experience. These are agents that somehow help with more relational experience, and they're referred to as empathogens. So the MDMA category, and mescaline is in that, somehow enhances people's ability to connect with each other and communicate with each other. And we're very interested in that in some of the research that we're doing. Now, as we were talking about 5-hydroxytryptamine, which is here, and again, that's serotonin. And serotonin, you know, I think people have pretty much heard of that. It's a neurotransmitter. It's kind of it's the molecule behind sort of listening to Prozac and all that stuff. Some people would say it's a happiness molecule, it's a joy molecule, it's a spirit molecule, it's been called. It's a fascinating neurotransmitter, and that's still not well understood. It probably is involved in sleep and wake cycles to some degree, and it's clearly associated with states of well-being and joy. But it's probably not a linear type of mechanism. So it's still being looked at quite a bit. And actually, the tryptamines are an important probe for serotonin biology. And so if we look at that, but we go back to a common precursor, L-tryptophan, which is an amino acid, and many of you may have run into it. It's also used in the form of 5-hydroxytryptophan, which is here, 5-HTP. It's used as an antidepressant. It's used for sleep. You can see that with, again, relatively minor substitutions, here the addition of 2 methyl groups, it becomes dimethyltryptamine. And from serotonin, you can see that 5-methoxy-DMT is here, and bufotenine is here. These are also fascinating agents. Bufotenine is a substance taken from a toad, actually, and smoked. And it's used actually in southwestern tribes as a source of DMT healing. It's a fascinating story. And part of what I'm doing is really from the tradition of Schultes and ethnobotany, is talking about these agents in context with people and the people that use them, but also not as sort of agents by themselves, but really sort of the ethnobotanical approach, which is how people understand them, how they use them, etc. So I think I've mentioned this already. The synergism is kind of amazing, and I was telling that story that the people from Schultes' lab were saying that, asking ayahuasca healers, and they were saying they sort of communicate. The plants tell them, and Wade Davis actually did an analysis where they looked at the number of species of plants in the Amazon, and sort of did a computation of how many tries it would take to find out this combination, and there was some extraordinary number of thousands of trials. So they concluded that serendipity was really pretty unlikely, that maybe these people are communicating with plants in a way that, and after drinking ayahuasca with them, no question that ayahuasca communicates to me. So a couple of other quick things about ayahuasca. So oral DMT becomes available in the presence of the harmalines, which is the other plant, the kapi vine. But the MAO inhibitors act as antidepressants, and they have a duration of action that's longer than DMT. And it's one of the reasons that I think ayahuasca is somewhat unique in that the integration is often facilitated by the plant itself, by the medicine itself. For the 2 to 3 day period afterward, people often feel better than they have. It has an antidepressant effect. It's often referred to as the afterglow. It's an interesting phenomenon with ayahuasca. And it might be one of the reasons that trauma can be healed, because when it's revisited with some of these effects on the serotonin axis, on fight or flight type responses, that the reconstruction or the reconsolidation of memory can be different. This is one of the mechanisms we think that's at work in how PTSD heals, the reconstruction of memories of the traumatic event. And some of these agents appear to facilitate that. This is just a picture of how it's done typically. It's typically in the Amazon done at night. There are a lot of reasons for that, but typically done as an all-night ceremony. And with special preparation, again, we've talked about integration. This is the preparation that people sort of have to put in some effort to get there. It's a bit of a pilgrimage, so you have to know that you're doing something special, and you really have to know why. There's a special diet, which generally is no sugar, no alcohol, and no salt. And if you're in there's some variation among the Peruvians, the Brazilians, and others. So in some places, they won't eat any red meat. They'll only eat a certain type of fish. So the diets tend to be very plain and somewhat restrictive. And people don't eat very much during this time. Pablo used to say that that's one of the ways that you can get through this easier is to not eat so much. Setting of intention is important, and of course the set and setting, as I've mentioned, and music and sound is an integral part of ceremonial healing. Someone once asked me when I was doing this work, and we were discussing it in a medical setting, like, so what's different about what these healers do? And when I thought about it, I thought it would be unheard of to administer a medicine to someone who is sick in these cultures without saying a prayer. It just wouldn't be done. And I struggle with that a little bit to sort of think about it. And I think for me, and maybe this will be helpful to you, those of you who have different theologies in mind, that it's worth thinking of prayer as a form of intentionality. If you're in a non-theistic world like Buddhism, for example, you might think of it as an aphorism. But it's simply verbalizing clearly sort of what you're there for and why you're doing it. That's really important because you're going to move into an altered state of consciousness. So that intentionality is really important. And it's one of the reasons that, again, I emphasize to you that I've approached this really as a physician, as a healer, not really in other ways. And so that tends to be a focus for me. And the other thing that I was alluding to is that it would be very unusual to have a healing ceremony, certainly in the Americas, without music and sound, without singing or music, which is probably more important in healing than we're aware of in our conventional world. It's not. It used to be part of healing. The old Asclepian temples in ancient Mediterranean area were always associated with water for healing, but also with music and sound. And in the Navajo world, beauty is considered a therapy. And walking in beauty is something that is important. And if you're not around beautiful things that are aesthetically pleasing, there is a belief that you can get sick from it, which is, I think it's a good thing to not just view it as something for recreation or art, but something integral to our experience of life and also important in healing. Again, another one of Pablo's paintings, which we won't go through. I was talking to you a little bit earlier about one of the phenomena, and that is that occurs in the ayahuasca world, and that is that people often experience a much deeper connection to nature after experiencing ayahuasca. And I came across this rather interesting thing in Harper's 2009. This was an advertisement for the American Indian College Fund. And I don't think you can see the small print too well up on the left. It says Allison Two Bears, 30 years old, environmental science major, Sitting Bull College in North Dakota, a mother of two who's learning about echinacea from her grandmother and her ethnobotany class. I was sort of fascinated by that because it says to think Indian is to save a plant that can save a people. So I thought that was a sort of interesting commentary. And this is probably Plains culture. This is Lakota area, Sitting Bull College in North Dakota. But it shows you the similarities in the Indigenous world of the Americas with respect to plants and people, for example. There's a lot more that we can go into, but I want to talk a little bit about some conclusions that I came to after that period that helped inform my practice of medicine. And it's one of the things that we've tried to do in integrative medicine. And I want to start by sharing with you some things that I wrote at the time that I was traveling there. And it's sort of some notes from my own journal. And it has to do with the elements of healing. And what we ordinarily do in Western scientific medicine is gather data and make a diagnosis and render a specific treatment, usually consisting of drugs or surgery, technology, either alone or in combination. But there's a larger process at work. It's always present, sometimes chaotic or mysterious, and sometimes miraculous. It encompasses and enhances the work of scientific medicine. In a sense, it's the context of scientific medicine, and that process we know is healing. Healing is that sort of broader response of the person to the trauma or crisis that he or she is facing. And it is a biologic phenomenon for sure, but in the broadest sense of biology, and it includes the mind, the body, and the spirit. Our mind-body dualism, we've, I think, come to realize is a fiction, a convenient fiction for reductionistic science, but a fiction. They're really not separate, and healing is that process that includes what a person experiences while they're getting a given therapy. It's somewhat of a miracle always because it involves unique aspects to the individual, and it's not entirely predictable, which is one of the difficult aspects with conventional medicine. We'll often use a given therapy for a patient. Some patients will get better and others won't, and even though things are the same. So we sort of have this idea in conventional medicine of host responses. But the larger question is sort of what's going on. And the thing that I think is important in this is that there is a unique quality to this experience with a given individual. This is one of the central paradoxes of modern biology. Modern biology, in its scientific sense, is searching for underlying laws, so-called nomothetic science, or laws that are applicable to all humans. But it's set against a rather intriguing phenomenon, and that is the uniqueness of the individual. So we see this interesting problem in modern biology and certainly in medicine of people being, quote, the same, but also unique. And it's fascinating. Niels Bohr, a famous physicist who actually wrote a lot about dualism and these kinds of ideas, said that the opposite of fact is falsehood, but the opposite of a great truth is often another great truth. And I think that it's what we see in biology is that people are both the same and unique. And it's a fascinating issue because that uniqueness, I think, is something important for healers to understand, to recognize, and is a struggle for those of us who are dealing with medicine, which is largely, in some settings, a list of algorithms, not exactly unique to the individual. But this whole business, this whole sort of question, when something really bad happens to you, your life just about stops. In fact, it does stop when something really bad happens, and you're really in an altered state of consciousness. And one of the reasons we came to this study is realizing that these agents are sort of an experimental laboratory for that. With major illness, you have three questions that just don't go away, and they're just right there in front of you. And the first one is, what's happening to me? Why? What is this? In conventional medical parlance, that's diagnosis. But to a person, it's a much bigger question. It's embedded in a whole life. It's not just, what's happening in a given organ or in a medical sense, it's what's happening in your life. It may be cancer or a major illness, but it's also a big change in your life. And so this first question of what's happening to me sort of right there appears to you. The second question is what will happen to me? Again, in conventional medical world, that's prognosis. But to a patient, it's much different. It's more like, will I be the same as I was before? What will change? Or as one patient once told me, who had just had her leg amputated, who's going to love me like this? And when she told me that, I sort of thought, wow, major illness is like that. Tremendous loss of self-esteem, questions about your future. And an experience that simply isn't represented well with say a diagnosis of, gastric carcinoma or something like that. It's just much bigger than that. And these three questions, I think, happen everywhere in the world when something really bad happens, and they are the questions that healers around the world address.
What was the third question?
The third, I'm glad you reminded me. The third question is, what will happen? The third question is, why did this happen? Right, so it's diagnosis, prognosis, and then why. And the why, in Western medicine, the why question is often some sort of pathophysiology explanations, like you got a microbe or a bacterium, and it caused this and that sort of thing. To a patient, the why question is often a crisis in meaning or transcendence. It's in some ways a spiritual question. And cancer patients often ask this, like, did I do something wrong? Did this happen to me because I did something wrong? So there's kind of a moral injury or quandary associated with it. And that why question is always a crisis in meaning, big M sort of meaning of your whole life, and small m in the sense of this particular episode. And the people that are doing some of the research that's now very much sort of in the news, you may have heard of it, the research on psilocybin at NYU, at Hopkins, and also here at UCSF. There are only 3 places in the country where this is happening. But psilocybin is being used in patients with severe advanced disease, end-of-life situations, cancer, and others, to deal with questions of anxiety and depression, etc. And the results have been positive. And some of the people that are doing this work, for example, some of the people from NYU who were here, said that they're impressed with this, this common comment that people are making, that somehow the psilocybin, for example, in the setting of cancer and end-of-life care, that it doesn't really change that, but they somehow have a greater sense of meaning after experiencing the psilocybin, meaning in their life. Understanding, for example, in a larger context, the why question. So it's fascinating. And Tony Bossis, who is one of the psychologists there, told me, he said, this is interesting. We're wondering if these are sort of meaning-making medicines in some way. And I thought, wow, that's a fascinating notion. I mentioned that to a couple of colleagues, and they didn't like it. I'm not sure why. But it's I think it's interesting. In any case, these sort of 3 questions really could be used to summarize the whole history of medicine and healing as an attempt to answer these 3 questions in ways that are both that have depth and understanding, but are also persuasive. And as I was talking earlier with Sudha and Selena, also because of their pragmatic effects. When I was showing you the pictures of Don Chapo in the seri, and he asked me to see his grandson, I was impressed with that because I expected he might not like Western medicine or this or that, but it wasn't any of that. And I was mentioning earlier that I came away, and I've seen this repeatedly with other traditional healers too that are good healers, that healers are tremendously pragmatic. There is a side to them that is pragmatic, that they tend to want to know what works and what doesn't. And I came away thinking that has an aspect of humility in it, that they're willing to be wrong, willing to be ineffective, and willing to admit that and say, what can I learn, or what can you teach me? What's important is how the person is doing. So it was a fascinating realization that I've come back to several times since, as I've worked through this sort of question of what makes a good healer, and we'll come to that in a minute. I want to move on to this whole question of healing, more broadly stated than just a given therapy. And so after those sort of three questions, what do you do? And these are some of the basics that period of study led me to. One of them certainly is empowerment. Healing is associated with a sense of belonging, and in psychology the term self-efficacy is often used to mean that if you decide to do something, you can make it happen in your life. There's a sense of empowerment associated with healing. And that part of that means that you have a sort of rightful place among the living. But in order to feel that self-esteem and that sense of empowerment, there has to be some way of the person actualizing himself or herself. And so we spent a lot of time with this, with prosthetics and therapies and various things. And it can be tricky because there is another side to it, a sort of counterbalancing need for acceptance. Some things simply are not going to be changed, and so it's tricky. But this overall sense that you can get through this, that you have the necessary tools and support, is important for healing, and that is the sense of empowerment. It's one of the things we work with in clinical practice. The best care is self-care, since you're not dependent on us, and we always, I think we should in our practices strive to enhance that where we can. The second element of healing is transformation or change. Healing is always about change, and sometimes the changes are in areas that we think would never change. They're often chaotic, out of control types of changes, changes in areas that you never imagined would happen. And for it to be effective, those changes, to some degree, have to be voluntary. There's a way that this last point is important in that it's possible to reject healing by holding on to the very ways that it might have contributed to the illness. So there is kind of a surrender, in a way, to the transformations that are necessary for healing. A third thing that we hear from patients very often, this is often, again, with cancer patients, is the importance of creative expression. Healing involves some creative expression that was not present formerly. It's more than just telling the facts of your story. It's more like being the protagonist in a novel that you're writing. There's a much deeper understanding of how your story is unfolding. It has nuance, and patients who are doing or going through this will often say that you learn to wear your wounds with pride, and that is, I think, important in healing, this kind of creative expression. Major illness is often associated with this tremendous loss of self-esteem. So people retreat, they feel shame or guilt or something less than, and that's why I think it's important to come through that, and creative expression is often the way that one can find that. The quest for meaning and transcendence is also fundamental to healing. It gets to this question of the transcendent experience, for example, associated with the tryptamines, the entheogenic experience. As I've mentioned, major illness is often attended by this question of why. And so there is a struggle, an effort to look at both the lessons involved and the challenges a major illness brings, but also a deeper reflection on the very meaning of things. And finally, sort of last but not least, one finds in many traditions in the literature of healing around the world its connection to the experience of unconditional love or acceptance. The important point here is unconditional. Rachel Remen years ago commented that the opposite of unconditional love is not hate or fear. It's actually judgment, which is an interesting idea. That it's sort of this critical, evaluative thing that we're always embedded in to some degree that needs to be suspended when a person is very ill. They need to be welcomed, received unconditionally in the state that they're in, fully seen and loved. So when I first gave this talk a long time ago at Duke, there was a patient actually who came up to me after. And she said, Doctor, I wholeheartedly agree. I just wonder if you can arrange it. So, so that's in the self-care world. But inescapable, I think, in the phenomenology of healing. So during this time in the mid-90s, I was traveling all these different places, and I was sort of wondering, okay, so I'm going to learn these other traditions and learn from these people, but how do I know if they're, good healers? And sort of asked myself that about healers in general over the years. As a physician, I always wanted to refer to people that I thought were good and would want to know about them and all that. And as I started sort of examining that question, there were several people that were sort of examples that I was sort of looking at. But I came away with these elements that I want to just share with you. Great healers, on the first topic, great healers have a kindness in their ways. They just do. But it especially comes out when they're in the presence of suffering. They just respond. But even in their most unassuming encounters with another person, I think great healers have a gentleness about them. And I think this is important. It could be covered up by time pressures and worry or other things, but in general, it's never too far under the surface of a great healer, their loving kindness. They certainly have skillful means. They've spent time developing proficiency, experience, and judgment. Skillful means are important. And again, their pragmatism is part of this. They're also joyful people. They have done the hard work of taking care of themselves to some degree. And they have a quality of this sympathetic joy about them, which is interesting to see. And the few people, it's not that common, but the ones that are really great have cultivated that. His Holiness the Dalai Lama once taught that sympathetic joy is the genuine joy that one feels at the good fortune and happiness of others. And it's in Buddhism, it's one of the 6 perfections, joyous effort, in the way of the Bodhisattva that comes originally from Shantideva, as you know. It's kind of, it's that generosity of spirit and joyfulness of spirit that you bring to the encounter that has a healing force to it. it doesn't mean you don't have your hard times as a healer, to say the least. But when you come to the work, you don't bring that with you. And in this whole issue of reverence is another thing. You know, ceremonial healing in traditional circles is in many ways a prayer ceremony. When I was working with Pablo, one of the things I encountered were all these stories of shamanic wars. You probably heard about these things. And one shaman sort of doesn't like another shaman, and they have their turf struggles and send darts to each other and various other things. It sounds like some of the cardiologists I know. So I was asking Pablo, you know, what about that? And Pablo told me this whole story about how he was very successful as an ayahuasca healer, and there was tremendous jealousy, and people thought he was making all this money and doing this and that, and he was getting all these darts, and so he had to just sort of make himself very scarce and, you know, not be so visible. And I said, what causes that? You know, what causes people, what causes those sort of envy and those battles? And he said, well, it's often brujeria, it's often dark shamanism. And he said the quality of dark shamanism is that when you think you own the power, that it's your power, you've already stepped over the line. You're already, that what you are is a vehicle for the power of higher forces to pass through you. And to the extent that you're clear and open as a vehicle, it will pass through better. When you begin to hold the power, to use it for your own enhancement or self-aggrandizement, you've already sort of moved into the other realm. And Pablo at that moment told me something that I still haven't forgotten. He said, in the presence of the divine, it's reverence and humility which will save you. As I was asking him also, you know, what if you have a really hard time with ayahuasca? He said, it's reverence and humility, which is a sort of fascinating idea just by itself. Well, I'm going to stop and give us a little bit of time to sort of collect our thoughts and close up. I'm so grateful to you all for listening to my inner reflections and meanderings. They're not very necessarily very complete or coherent, but certainly well-intentioned. And so I'm grateful for all of your attention. Thank you. Yeah, no, it's a great question. It's a great question. And Rick Strassman's work, you know, was with Pure DMT, and he did a lot of the pioneering work on DMT, some of the basic stuff. So there are a lot of there's some aspects to comment on. DMT is relatively short-acting when used as pure DMT, whether it's given parenterally as an injection or snorted or smoked, which are the ways that it's done. It definitely commonly produces an altered state and often mystical or transcendent experience, often associated with entities and beings of an otherworldly sort. Ayahuasca is different in the sense, I mean, it's the same in the sense that DMT is there. What's different about ayahuasca is that it's orally active. So the absorption of DMT is much slower, and it's in the context of the harmalines, which are MAO inhibitors and have independent psychotropic effects. They're antidepressants, as MAO inhibitors are, and they're longer acting. So my opinion is that DMT is very powerful in its own way, but it's very quick, and people often are left with this sort of sense that, wow, something, you know, very unusual happened, but I'm not sure what it was. I'm not saying that pure DMT doesn't have a role. I'm just saying that in my experience, it's much shorter and it's different. It is being looked at as one of the tryptamines that can enhance meaning, but again, it's hard to say and probably I should emphasize that we think that these agents are powerful and important, but we don't think they should be used alone. We think they should be used with therapy, both before, during, and after. And this is why we often refer to this whole area as a type of medication-assisted psychotherapy, to emphasize the importance of therapy both before, during, and after. And as we work with trauma patients, even more so. But I think for people in general, that these experiences are often what Maslow called peak experiences. They're very profound. And if a person doesn't have support in integrating them, they can often sort of fragment them and sort of split them off to the side, where they really just don't know what happened, and it isn't helpful. So I think probably the main answer to your question is all of these agents should be used with therapy. I haven't been to Vietnam, but I have done exactly that with other traditional healers and other doctors in several places in the world, most notably Kenya. I worked in East Africa for almost 8 years and worked with a lot of traditional Maasai healers, for example. And I agree with you. I think there is a spiritual yearning in the U.S. People have commented that it may be one of the reasons that there's a sort of renewed interest in these agents. And there are a lot of different aspects to that. And it's not to... there are a lot of issues that have to do with religion and all that. But suffice it to say that when we refer to spiritual growth as an experience of greater meaning or the transcendence of some sort of earthly limitation, I think that those of us who work in sort of the secular humanist institutions of the world, non-religious like UCSF, can use that language to explain it. But I agree with you. I think there is a spiritual yearning. So it's a really great question, and really important for all of us. I think I would just point to those people, that you work with who have these special qualities, and make an effort to spend some time with them, like I did with Sudha and Selena, who are other healers who have a healing effect on me. Yeah, the self-care for healers is really important. We often tell the residents, that it's hard to take care of the patients when you're sicker than the patients are. And on the topic of these series, in global health, there's an aphorism that there is no health without mental health. So even for those of us who are physically doing well, if you have a lot of sort of fear, anger, grumpiness, there's some healing to be done there. And it's important to do that as a healer. The self-care job is important, not just for you, but for the people that you work with as well, the other people in your life. So yeah, in fact, some of the work that we've done has really actually been focused on that, trying to work with healers for those exact reasons. They often get left out. Well, thank you so much. What a pleasure to be with you all.